It was a chilly evening when we decided to head out. My wife, Sophie, and I had been talking about getting away from the noise of the city for a while. Something simple, a weekend camping trip to clear our heads. Just us, the woods, and the peace of nature. I think we both needed it, really. Life had been hectic, and the idea of spending a couple of days away from work, our phones, and everything else felt like the perfect escape. We drove to a small national park just outside of Ashland, Oregon, about 2 hours from where we lived. The plan was to hike to a secluded spot we'd found on a map and set up camp by a quiet, small lake. We were both in our early 30s, relatively fit, and the thought of a short trek didn't intimidate us. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing weekend. As we made our way down the dusty trail, the trees were dense, their limbs heavy with the weight of fall. The air had that crisp, earthy smell. You know, the one where you can practically taste the pine. The sun was beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long, slender shadows on the ground. I could feel the temperature dropping. We reached the spot just as the last bit of sunlight faded, our small campfire casting light onto the ground. We pitched the tent, a lightweight two-person that we'd bought for these kinds of trips. I made a fire while Sophie worked on dinner, the smell of garlic and vegetables hanging in the air. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. It was one of those comfortable silences you get with someone who knows you well. That night, we lay on our backs inside the tent, staring through the mesh at the stars above. It was quiet, too quiet almost, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little noise in the dark. The crackle of the fire outside, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant hoot of an owl, nothing alarming. But there was something strange about the way it felt, like the world was holding its breath. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The fire had died down, leaving only embers. The air was freezing. Sophie was still asleep beside me, her breath coming out in little clouds. But something was off. The stillness outside had changed. It wasn't the calm, natural quiet anymore. Felt wrong, like something was out there, just waiting. I wasn't sure what made me get out of the tent. Maybe it was the unsettling silence. Maybe it was just that gnawing feeling that had started creeping into my chest. Either way, I grabbed the flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent. Outside, the night was darker than I remembered. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the trees in an almost impenetrable blackness. The fire pit, now just a few smoldering coals, cast weak, flickering light. It didn't take long before I felt the cold seep into my bones. I stood there for a minute, listening, but all I could hear was the rustling of the wind in the treetops. Then I saw it. In the far distance, just outside the reach of the firelight, there was a figure standing between the trees. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But then it moved, slowly, purposefully. It was a man, tall, hunched slightly, wearing dark clothing. It was hard to tell much else. He was standing too far away, just beyond the reach of the light. But something about him felt off. I could sense it in my gut. He wasn't just some hiker or camper who had wandered too far off the trail. This wasn't a normal person. There was no sound as he moved, no footsteps on the dry ground, just that unnatural stillness. I stepped back into the tent, careful not to wake Sophie. I grabbed the small knife I kept in my pack and held it tightly in my hand. My heart was pounding in my chest now, my breath coming faster as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. There was no reason for someone to be out here at this hour, especially in the middle of nowhere like this. I looked back out the tent flap. The figure was still there, watching, not moving. I'm not sure how long I stood there, staring at him, but eventually, he turned and disappeared back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as he'd appeared. The feeling of unease didn't go away, though. It only grew stronger. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening for any sign of movement. Was he really gone? Or was he just waiting for the right moment to approach? Sophie stirred beside me. Her eyes blinked open, and she looked at me, confused but groggy. "What is it?" she whispered. "I think I saw someone," I said, my voice low. I didn't want to scare her, but the worry was all over my face. She sat up, looking out the flap of the tent, but I didn't want her to go outside. "Stay here. I'll check." I slipped out of the tent again, the knife still in my hand. My breath was shallow, my steps cautious as I moved slowly toward the campfire. There was no sign of the man, no movement in the trees. Everything seemed normal again, almost too normal. I stood by the fire for a few minutes, trying to calm my racing mind. What had I seen? And why did it feel like it was watching us? The thought that we weren't alone here in the woods was overwhelming, but I had to keep it together. We were just two people in the middle of nowhere. No reason to panic, right? Eventually, I decided to head back into the tent, but before I could make it, I heard something. A twig snapping. Just one. Like someone was stepping over it carefully. The sound was too close. Way too close. I looked around, but the figure was gone. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement near the trees behind us. A shadow drifting like smoke in the darkness. My heart rate spiked again, but I didn't have time to think. Something told me it was now or never. I ran back to the tent, zippered it shut, and whispered to Sophie, "We need to leave. Now." She was startled but didn't argue. We packed up quickly, moving with a speed I didn't know we were capable of in the dark. We didn't waste time. I just needed to get us out of there. I couldn't explain why, but the urgency of it gnawed at me. As we hurried down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again. But the trees were still, the night still. We were completely alone. Took us hours to find our way back to the car. By the time we were safely driving home, the sun was already rising. Looking back, I don't know what it was that made me feel so uneasy. Maybe it was the way he moved, like he wasn't fully human. Or maybe it was the way he just stood there, waiting. Whatever it was, I've never gone camping again. The woods are vast, and in those quiet, isolated spaces, you can never be sure what's watching you from the shadows. I remember the trip like it was yesterday. It was late September, just before the cold really settled in. The air was crisp, the leaves had started turning, and the smell of damp earth clung to everything. It was the perfect time for a solo camping trip, or at least that's what I thought. I had driven a couple of hours out to a national forest that wasn't too popular. One of those places that only locals really knew about. The kind where the trails weren't marked too well, and the campsites weren't official. That was exactly what I wanted. Solitude, peace, and a break from the constant hum of life back in town. I parked my truck off a dirt road that cut through the woods and hiked in about 5 miles, just deep enough that I wouldn't have to worry about running into anyone. I found a small clearing near a stream, far enough from the water to stay dry but close enough for convenience. It was a beautiful spot. The trees formed a natural wall around me, and the ground was soft with a thick bed of fallen leaves. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got to work making a small fire. By the time the sun started setting, I was settled in. I had a simple meal, stretched out near the fire, and listened to the sounds of the woods. The occasional crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, as the darkness fully took over and the fire was the only real light source, I started to feel off. I've camped alone plenty of times, and I know the difference between normal forest sounds and something else. This was something else. First, it was just a feeling, that strange, almost primal sense that someone or something was watching you. I brushed it off, Being alone in the dark can do that to a person, and I figured my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a footstep, not a twig snapping randomly in the woods, not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. A footstep, slow, deliberate, too heavy to be anything but a person. I sat up, every muscle in my body going stiff. My fire had burned down to embers, casting only a dim glow around the clearing. I couldn't see past the tree line. I listened. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a deer stepping through the leaves. I told myself that, forced myself to relax, and eventually, I crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easily, though. Every noise, every gust of wind through the trees had me on edge. And then, sometime deep in the night, I woke up to something much worse. A sound just outside my tent. A quiet, deliberate shuffling. Something or someone was right outside. I held my breath, my heart hammering so hard I swore it would give me away. The fabric of the tent was thin, and I knew that if I made a sound, whatever was out there would hear me. Then slowly the sound moved, around my tent, circling. I reached for the knife I always kept nearby when I camped. My fingers curled around the handle, but I didn't move. I just listened. The steps stopped. The silence was worse. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed, maybe hours. And then finally I heard it. Faint but there. A single step. Then another. Moving away. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light filtered through the trees, I finally unzipped my tent and stepped outside. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. But I knew what I heard. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started hiking back toward my truck. I didn't care that I'd only planned to stay another night. I wasn't staying out there any longer. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every sound put me on edge. Every shift in the trees made my heart race. Then, about a mile from my truck, I found something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A footprint. A human footprint. Barefoot. Right there in the middle of the trail. And it wasn't mine. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just moved. I walked as fast as I could without running, without looking back. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back, jumped inside, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and as I pulled back onto the dirt road, I glanced into my rearview mirror. Nothing, just the trees. But I knew something or someone had been out there with me, and they had been watching. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. Just me, the open woods, a tent, and a couple of nights under the stars. I had always been the type who preferred solitude when camping. No crowded campgrounds, no noisy groups, just nature and me. I chose a spot deep in the forests of British Columbia. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I had found a couple of years back while hiking. It was far enough from any trail that I never saw another person when I camped there, and the land sloped down to a small river, which made for a great water source. The surrounding trees were thick, mostly firs and pines, their canopies dense enough to make it feel like dusk even in the middle of the day. I had camped there a few times before and never had any problems. No bears, no unexpected visitors, just silence and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I arrived early in the afternoon, parked my truck about a mile away from the site, and hiked in with my gear. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and the ground was soft under my boots. The rain from a few days ago had left a few muddy patches, but overall, the ground was firm. I had checked the weather beforehand, no rain expected, just cool autumn temperatures. I set up my tent near the base of a large tree, facing the river, then gathered wood for a fire. By the time the sun started dipping behind the trees, I had everything ready. The fire crackled softly as I sat beside it, eating my dinner, a simple meal of canned beans and jerky. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, an occasional owl hooting in the distance, the gentle rush of the river. It was perfect. That first night was uneventful. I fell asleep warm in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind push through the trees. When I woke up in the morning, everything was as it should be. No disturbances, no signs of animals near my tent. I took my time making breakfast, drinking coffee from a tin mug as I watched the sun climb higher. I spent most of the day exploring the area. I hiked along the river for a few miles, followed game trails through the trees, and even found a small clearing I had never seen before. It was a beautiful day, cool but not cold, the sun occasionally breaking through the canopy. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed something strange. As I made my way back toward camp, I had the uneasy feeling that something was off. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe I was just too deep in my own head. But then I saw it. There were footprints in the mud near my camp. They weren't mine. I froze, staring at them. They were fresh, probably within the last few hours, and they led from the tree line toward my tent. My first thought was that maybe another hiker had stumbled across my site, but the location was too remote for that to be likely. I followed the tracks carefully. They circled my tent once, then led toward the fire pit. Whoever had been there had stood near my fire, then walked a few feet toward the river before disappearing into the woods. I looked around, my heart pounding. The forest was silent, too silent. That was what set me on edge the most. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural stillness. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone watching me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to be chased out by something that might have been nothing. Maybe it had been a hunter passing through. Maybe someone had just been curious about my campsite. There was no real reason to assume anything worse than that. I kept my knife on me as I went about my evening routine. I built up the fire, cooked my food, and tried to act normal, even though every fiber of my being told me something wasn't right. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside my tent made me jolt awake. The wind shifting the trees sounded like footsteps. The distant snap of a branch sent my heart racing. At some point in the middle of the night, I heard something, a noise that didn't belong. It was faint at first, a soft shuffling, like something moving through the undergrowth. Then it grew closer, a deliberate sound. I lay completely still, barely breathing. My knife was in my hand, my fingers tight around the handle. The sound stopped just outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, not an animal, person. I stayed motionless, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, just as slowly as it had come, it faded away, footsteps retreating into the woods. I waited until the first light of dawn before unzipping my tent. The fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was still eerily silent. I checked the ground. There were more footprints. This time, they led right up to my tent. Someone had been standing there, just inches away from me as I slept, watching. That was enough. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, barely stopping to eat. The entire time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I wasn't alone. The hike back to my truck felt longer than it should have. The trees pressed in on me, and every little sound made my pulse spike. But I didn't see anyone. When I reached my truck, I locked the doors the second I was inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something move between the trees. A figure, standing there watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I just drove. I never went back to that spot again. The rain had been coming down in steady sheets for hours, drumming against the canopy of trees above me. The campsite, deep in the woods of eastern Oregon, felt more isolated with every passing minute. I'd been looking forward to the quiet escape for weeks. Just me, my dog, and the forest. But as the storm worsened, the place started to feel less like a peaceful retreat and more like something I had stumbled into by mistake. I set up my tent as the first thunder rumbled across the sky, knowing the worst of the storm was still coming. I'd camped here before, but something about this night felt off. Maybe it was the sudden intensity of the rain or the way the air seemed to have thickened, making it hard to breathe. The ground had soaked through quickly, turning everything into a muddy mess. Even with the tarp beneath the tent, I could feel the cold dampness creeping in through the floor. The wind picked up, sending a shiver down my spine as it whistled through the branches above. My dog, Buddy, a golden retriever, was already in the tent with me, lying on his side. He wasn't usually one to be affected by weather, but even he seemed uneasy tonight. He kept shifting around, occasionally whining softly. I opened the small camping stove I had brought, lighting it with a match to prepare some dinner. The warm glow from the flame flickered against the walls of the tent, casting long shadows on the fabric. I'd hoped for a quiet night to reflect, but the rain and the wind had other plans. The sound of the storm combined with the occasional crack of thunder rattling through the trees had made it hard to focus. By the time I finished eating, the night had settled into an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional gust of wind or the soft pattering of raindrops. My phone had no signal, not that I expected it to. The area was remote, a place where people went to disconnect. But tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't an immediate threat, just a growing sense of unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. Buddy got up suddenly, ears perked, his head tilting toward the door of the tent. He didn't bark, but his body was rigid, alert. I tried to calm him down, but something in the way he was acting made the hairs on my neck stand up. I stood, unzipped the flap of the tent, and peeked out into the blackness. The rain slanted sideways, and the wind howled through the trees, but there was nothing out there, just the wet, dark wilderness stretching endlessly into the night. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, though. I felt it deep in my chest. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. There were no other campers this far into the woods, I told myself. No one would be out here in weather like this, and if anyone was, they'd be crazy to get this close to my campsite. I zipped up the tent again and sat down, trying to ignore the feeling of paranoia creeping over me. Buddy finally settled down, lying back on the ground, though his eyes still flicked toward the entrance. I leaned back, letting out a deep breath. The rain had slowed a bit, and I decided to try and get some sleep. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to Buddy growling softly. The sound was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then he did it again, more insistently this time. His body was tensed, hackles raised, and his growl grew louder. I sat up, listening. It was quiet, too quiet.
No rain.
No wind, just the faint sound of Buddy's growls. I looked out the small window of the tent, but all I could see was darkness. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, the type of feeling that made me question everything I had ever learned about being alone in the woods. I grabbed the flashlight from the corner of the tent and clicked it on, scanning the area outside. But nothing was there, just the windswept trees and the wet, muddy ground. Then I heard it, a rustling sound from somewhere in the trees behind me. It was faint but distinct, like someone or something moving through the brush. My breath caught in my throat. I listened harder. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was out there, moving quietly, trying not to be heard. My heart began to race. I flicked the flashlight off, listening carefully. The rustling stopped. For a moment, All I could hear was the thudding of my own pulse. I waited, trying to steady my breath, but the noise had stopped. Was it an animal, or had I imagined it? Maybe it was just the wind, playing tricks on my mind. Buddy's growl turned into a low, rumbling bark, and he jumped up, his eyes locked on the entrance of the tent. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and every instinct I had told me that something wasn't right. I grabbed the flashlight again, shining it out the door of the tent, and froze. There, just at the edge of the light's reach, stood a figure. A man. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could make out the shape of his body. Tall, broad, dressed in dark clothing, maybe a raincoat. He was soaking wet, but he didn't seem to mind the rain. His eyes reflected the light from the flashlight, and I could feel the weight of his gaze through the thin fabric of the tent. I don't know how long we stood like that, me, frozen in place, Buddy barking furiously, and the man just watching. I should have done something, but the sight of him in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night, had paralyzed me. I wanted to call out, to yell at him, but the words wouldn't come. I wanted to run, but where? I was trapped in the middle of nowhere, and my only weapon was the fear clawing at my throat. The man took a step forward, and that's when I snapped into action. I grabbed the knife from my bag, clutching it tightly in my hands. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Was he here to hurt me? Was he lost? I didn't know, but I couldn't sit here and wait to find out. Buddy was frantic now, pulling at the leash I had tied him to inside the tent. I took a deep breath and, before I could second-guess myself, unzipped the tent flap and bolted outside. The rain hit me like a wall, soaking me instantly. My flashlight barely cut through the downpour, but I kept it trained on the man. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, his eyes reflecting the light like some kind of animal. I raised the knife, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "What do you want?" He didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes locked on mine. The seconds dragged on, stretching into eternity. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quietly as he had come. I stood there for a long moment, the storm swirling around me, unsure of what had just happened. My breath came in sharp gasps, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I don't know what the man wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay in that tent tonight. I packed up as quickly as I could, tossing my gear haphazardly into my backpack. Buddy, who had calmed down somewhat, whined, but I didn't have time to explain. I couldn't stay here anymore. There was something wrong with this place, something I couldn't shake. I decided to hike out to get as far away from the campsite as I could. I didn't know where I was going or if I was even heading in the right direction. The storm had worsened again, the rain so thick it felt like the forest itself was closing in around me. But I didn't care. I had to get out. As I stumbled through the mud, I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing there, just the woods. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone was still watching me from the shadows. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally reached the edge of the woods and the road that led back to the main highway. I could hear the distant hum of cars and the sounds of civilization. It was enough to break the spell the forest had cast on me. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I couldn't help but look back into the dark woods. Whatever had happened tonight, I didn't want to think about it anymore. When I finally made it back to my car and started the engine, I didn't look back. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, somewhere watching. And maybe, just maybe, I had made a mistake by leaving him behind. I was driving through the middle of nowhere, a long stretch of highway that cut through empty fields and distant tree lines. It had been a long day behind the wheel, the kind of drive where the road in front of you seems endless, and every town you pass is smaller than the last. The gas stations were getting farther apart, the radio stations weaker, until all I could hear was static. My phone had lost service hours ago, and I hadn't seen another car in what felt like forever. I had left early that morning, heading west for a job that started in a few days. I didn't have a strict timeline, just an old truck loaded with camping gear, a cooler full of food, and a plan to stop somewhere quiet for the night. I had been keeping an eye out for a place to pull over, maybe a rest stop or a clearing off the road, but I hadn't seen much, just miles and miles of empty land, stretching out under a darkening sky. The sun had dipped low on the horizon, turning everything deep orange. The air had that heavy stillness that comes just before nightfall. I knew I needed to stop soon. I was getting tired, and driving drowsy in the middle of nowhere wasn't a risk I was willing to take. Then I spotted it, a dirt pull-off on the right side of the road, leading to a small patch of trees. It wasn't much, but it was something. I slowed down, flicked on my turn signal out of habit, though there was no one around to see it, and pulled onto the rough dirt. My tires crunched over gravel and dried grass as I rolled to a stop. It wasn't an official campground, just a little clearing hidden from the road by a thin line of trees. But it was flat, secluded, and quiet. That was all I needed. I shut off the engine and climbed out, stretching my legs. The silence out here was different from the kind you get in a city or even in a small town. There were no distant hums of traffic, no voices, no music. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the occasional chirp of insects. I grabbed my tent from the back of the truck and set it up quickly. I had done this 100 times before, and my hands worked through the motions without much thought. Once the tent was up, I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and set my flashlight nearby. Dinner was simple, just a sandwich and a bottle of water from the cooler. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, eating in the fading light, watching as the sky turned from orange to deep blue. The temperature was dropping, and I could see my breath in the air. That's when I noticed it. Something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a prickling at the back of my neck, a slight unease settling in my stomach. I scanned the tree line, my eyes moving over the dark shapes of the branches. Nothing looked out of place. No movement, no sounds beyond the usual rustling of leaves. But the feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off. It was just the isolation, I told myself. Being out here alone with no other cars, no cell service. It was enough to put anyone on edge. I finished eating, packed away my food, and climbed into my tent. I zipped the door shut, clicked off my flashlight, and lay back, listening to the quiet. Took me a while to fall asleep. That uneasy feeling lingered, making my thoughts race. But eventually, exhaustion won. My breathing slowed, my body relaxed, and I drifted off. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was the kind of wake-up that doesn't feel natural, like something had pulled me from sleep. My eyes snapped open, my heart already pounding. I held my breath, listening. First, I heard nothing, just the wind, the occasional creak of branches. But then crunch, a sound just outside my tent. Slow, deliberate, footsteps. My blood ran cold. I stayed completely still, every muscle in my body tensed. The sound came again, closer this time. Something moving just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers wrapping around the handle, but I didn't turn it on. If there was someone or something out there, I didn't want to give away my position. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I strained my ears, trying to hear past the hammering of my own heartbeat. Then, from outside, just inches from where I lay, I heard breathing. Slow, heavy, not an animal, person. I gripped the flashlight tighter, every instinct screaming at me to do something, to move, to run, but I stayed frozen. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away, crunch, crunch, fading into the distance. I didn't move. I waited, my body rigid, until the sounds disappeared completely. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Finally, when I was sure I was alone, I reached for the zipper of my tent, moving as quietly as I could. I unzipped it just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty. My truck sat where I had left it, the trees standing still in the cold night air. But something was wrong. The driver's side door was open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. My stomach twisted as I crawled out of the tent, keeping low, my flashlight still off. I moved toward the truck, every step slow and careful. When I reached it, I peered inside. Nothing looked disturbed. The keys were still in my bag, untouched. The glove compartment was closed. The seats were empty, but then I saw them. Footprints, in the dirt, leading from my tent to the truck, then off into the trees. I stood there, heart hammering, staring at the tracks. Whoever had been here had left, but they had been close, watching, maybe trying to get inside my truck. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my sleeping bag, threw it into the truck bed, and ripped my tent down in record time. I didn't care how messy it was. I just needed to go. Within minutes, I was back in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the wheel. I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the highway, tires spitting gravel. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached a gas station near the next town. I pulled in under the bright lights, parked near the other cars, and finally let out the breath I had been holding. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Whoever had been out there, they hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't tried to hurt me, but they had been there, watching, and that was enough to make sure I never camped on the side of the road again. I never thought much about fear. It wasn't that I considered myself fearless, just that I hadn't come face to face with anything that truly unsettled me. Not in the way people talked about fear, the deep, gut-wrenching kind that makes your hands shake and your breath turn shallow. That changed one summer when I decided to go camping alone in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. I wasn't a survival expert, but I had been on enough trips to know the basics. I packed light but efficiently: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, extra batteries. I brought my old hunting rifle too, just in case. Not that I expected to use it, but it gave me peace of mind. There were bears in the area, and the thought of waking up to one sniffing around my tent didn't sit right with me. I picked a spot miles away from the nearest trail, deep enough in the forest that I wouldn't hear the occasional group of hikers passing through. That was the point, to get away from everything. I worked in construction, long days in the heat, dealing with people I didn't particularly like. The solitude was supposed to be a break from all that. I hiked in around noon, following an old game trail that I had found on a map weeks before. The forest was thick, the trees towering above like sentinels watching over the land. Birds chirped, the occasional rustle of a squirrel darting through the underbrush. It was peaceful. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small creek and set up camp. The place was perfect, flat ground, plenty of dry wood for a fire, and fresh water nearby. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and sat by the creek for a while, letting the cold water run over my hands. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. As night fell, I built a fire and cooked a small meal, just some canned beans and a bit of jerky. The flames crackled, and the heat felt good against the evening chill. I leaned back against a log, staring into the fire, listening to the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard something else. It wasn't an animal noise, at least not one I recognized. A crunch of leaves, a deliberate step. Too heavy for a deer. I sat up, listening. Silence. The fire flickered, casting long shadows that danced against the trees. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a raccoon or some other scavenger sniffing around. Still, I took my rifle from where it rested against the log and set it across my lap, just in case. The night stretched on. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. I stayed by the fire until it burned low, then crawled into my tent. I kept the rifle close, my hand resting on the stock as I drifted off. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something was outside my tent. I lay still, holding my breath. The sound was faint, a soft shuffle, like someone stepping carefully through the leaves. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I reached for my flashlight, slowly, trying not to make a sound. The noise outside stopped. I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as I flicked the light on, there was a loud, deliberate crunch. Footsteps, slow, measured. Someone was out there. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. I couldn't see anything beyond the thin fabric of the tent, but I knew I wasn't alone. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving only faint orange light against the trees. Then came the breathing. It was close, just outside the tent. A deep, steady inhale, exhale. I gripped my rifle, my finger resting near the trigger. My mind raced through options. Could be some drunk hiker lost in the woods. Could be something worse. I had to act. With a deep breath, I unzipped the tent in one swift motion and swung my flashlight outside. Nothing. The clearing was empty, the trees silent. The only thing moving was the fire, glowing faintly in the night. I stepped out slowly, the rifle raised, sweeping the light over the trees. My stomach was tight, my pulse hammering in my throat. I listened, but the forest had gone still. Too still. The usual sounds, crickets, owls, the rustling wind were gone. I stood there for a long time, scanning the darkness. Then, convinced that whoever or whatever had been there was gone, I retreated back into the tent. Sleep didn't come easy after that. By morning, I was ready to leave. Something felt off. I packed up quickly, my eyes darting to the tree line every few minutes. The whole time, I had the uneasy feeling that I was being watched. Then I found the footprints. They weren't mine. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. The prints were deep, made by heavy boots. They led off into the woods but didn't come back. Someone had been here, watching me. I didn't stick around to find out who. I threw my pack over my shoulder and started moving fast, following the creek back the way I came. The whole time, I felt like something was behind me, just out of sight. I didn't stop. Hours later, I reached my truck, tossed my gear in the back, and drove until I was miles away from those woods. I don't camp alone anymore. I still don't know who was out there that night, or what they wanted, and I don't ever want to find out. I was deep in the mountains of Montana, far from any town, far from anyone who could hear me if I screamed. It was late September, and the air had that crisp bite that signaled the beginning of the cold season. The leaves were already turning, a sea of reds and oranges stretching out across the rolling hills. I had been planning this hunting trip for months. Just me, my rifle, and the vast wilderness. I had driven out early in the morning, my truck bouncing along an old logging road, barely visible under the thick layer of fallen leaves. I was looking for elk, but I wouldn't mind a good deer if the opportunity presented itself. After a couple of hours of driving, I pulled off to the side, grabbed my pack, and started hiking into the woods. I wanted to get as far away from the road as possible. I didn't want to hear engines, didn't want to see another human. Just silence, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional distant cry of some unseen animal. After about 5 miles of hiking, I found a good spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing, surrounded on 3 sides by dense pines, with a gentle slope leading down to a narrow creek. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and ate a quick meal before heading out to scout the area. I moved slowly, stepping carefully to avoid breaking twigs underfoot. The last thing I wanted was to alert every animal in the area to my presence. I found fresh tracks near the creek elk moving through the area recently. I followed them for a bit, noting their direction. If I was lucky, I could set up near a good spot in the morning and wait for them to come through again. As the sun started to dip behind the mountains, I made my way back to camp. That first night was uneventful. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rattled the branches, an owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and every so often, I could hear the faint rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. It was peaceful. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I took my rifle, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started toward the area where I had seen the tracks. I moved slowly, carefully, stopping every so often to listen. The forest was still waking up, the sky just starting to turn pink with the first hints of daylight. Then I smelled it, something foul, something that didn't belong in the crisp morning air. It was like rotting meat, thick and heavy, making my stomach turn. I stopped, scanning the trees around me, looking for any sign of a carcass. I had seen dead animals before, but this was different. This smelled old, like something that had been sitting out in the sun for days. I pressed on, keeping my steps light, my rifle in my hands, ready. A few minutes later, I found it, a deer or what was left of one. Its ribs were stripped clean, the hide peeled back like someone had been butchering it. But it wasn't right. The cuts were jagged, uneven, like they had been made with something dull or even torn apart by hand. I crouched down, inspecting the carcass. There were no bullet holes, no arrows. Whatever had killed this thing hadn't been a hunter. I stood up, suddenly feeling exposed. Something had been here recently. I had been hunting long enough to know that predators don't just leave a kill like this. If a bear or a mountain lion had taken down this deer, it would have stayed close, guarding its meal. I scanned the trees, but nothing moved. The forest was silent, too silent. I moved away from the carcass, my rifle tight in my hands. I didn't run, but I walked faster than before, putting distance between me and whatever had done that. I made my way up a ridge, found a spot with a good vantage point, and settled in to wait. Hours passed. I watched, listened. Birds returned, chirping lazily from the branches above. A squirrel darted across a fallen log. The forest was coming back to life. Then I saw movement, a figure half hidden by the trees. At first, I thought it was another hunter, but something about it wasn't right. They were moving strangely, not in the slow, careful way a hunter would. Their steps were uneven, almost staggering. I raised my rifle slightly, not aiming, but ready. The figure stepped out from behind a tree, and my stomach turned to ice. It was a man, or at least it had been a man. His clothes were torn, hanging in shreds off his body. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were empty, just dark pits staring right at me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he took a step toward me. Something in my gut told me to run. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but I didn't move, couldn't. Then he smiled. It was slow, unnatural, like his face wasn't used to the motion. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth stained dark with something I didn't want to think about. He took another step. I raised my rifle. He stopped, For a long moment, we just stared at each other. My finger hovered over the trigger, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't know what I was looking at, but I knew it wasn't normal. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I sat there for a long time, heart racing, waiting to see if he would come back. He didn't. By the time the sun started to set, I made up my mind. I wasn't spending another night out there. I packed up my camp in record time, barely stopping to eat. As I hiked back toward my truck, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see him standing in the trees, watching me. I never did. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back and climbed in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Then I drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in town, back where there were people, lights, noise, things that felt real. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. I haven't been back to those woods since. I was 26 when I decided to camp near the old graveyard. It wasn't for thrills or some dumb challenge. I wasn't that kind of person. I just needed a quiet place, away from everything. Life had been weighing on me, pressing down like a thick fog. I figured a couple of nights under the open sky, away from people, would help clear my head. The place I picked was a small cemetery on the outskirts of a rural town, somewhere deep in the middle of nowhere. I had driven for hours, leaving behind the city and its noise. The graveyard was old, barely maintained, with leaning headstones and patches of tall grass overtaking the area. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, the kind that looked endless when you stood at its border. I parked my truck on the dirt road nearby and grabbed my gear. It was late afternoon, the sky was overcast, and there was that crisp autumn chill in the air. The wind had that damp, earthy scent that always came before rain. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started walking toward the graveyard. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of the place. Not fear, not anything supernatural, just the heavy silence of it. No birds chirping, no distant sounds of cars, just stillness. I found a small clearing near the edge of the cemetery, close to the tree line but not too far from the gravestones. It seemed like the best spot, a little secluded but not deep into the woods. The ground was firm, mostly dry despite the season. I set up my tent quickly, the fabric snapping in the wind as I secured the stakes. I rolled out my sleeping bag and got everything in order before the sun dipped too low. By the time I finished, the light had started fading. The sky turned a deep shade of gray, thick clouds creeping in, threatening rain. I gathered some wood from the forest floor and built a small fire, just enough to keep warm. Sitting there, staring into the flames, I let my mind wander. It had been a rough few months. Work was a mess, and everything in my personal life felt like it was unraveling. I just needed space to think. As night fully set in, the cold became sharper. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and checked my watch. It was just after 9. The fire crackled, filling the silence with occasional pops and shifts. I stared out into the graveyard, the headstones barely visible in the dim light. Something about the place started to feel different. Not wrong, not terrifying, just off. Maybe it was the way the wind had suddenly died down, leaving the air unnaturally still. Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too far. I shook the feeling off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. A few minutes later, I heard something, a rustling in the tall grass. It was soft at first, barely noticeable over the fire's crackling. Then it stopped. I sat up, listening. Silence. I convinced myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal passing through. But the feeling in my gut didn't settle. I kept my eyes on the darkness beyond the fire's reach, scanning the shadows for any movement. Nothing. I sighed and leaned back, trying to relax. Then, another sound. Not rustling this time, something heavier. A footstep. It was close. Too close. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the graveyard. The white light cut through the dark, revealing nothing but stone and overgrown grass. My heart pounded. I turned the light toward the trees. The trunks stood like tall, dark pillars, unmoving. Then, just for a second, I thought I saw something shift between them. A shape, a figure. I tensed, gripping the flashlight tighter. I aimed the beam directly at where I had seen the movement, but there was nothing there. Just trees and darkness. I swallowed hard. My breath felt too loud in the stillness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my eyes were just adjusting to the dark, playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to calm down, to focus. If it was an animal, I needed to be careful. If it was a person, I didn't even want to finish that thought. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Eventually, the fire burned low. The air grew colder. I didn't want to let it go out completely, but I also didn't want to waste the little wood I had left. Reluctantly, I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. The fabric felt too thin, too fragile. I lay there, listening to the quiet. Every small sound outside made my skin crawl. Then the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate. They weren't coming from the forest this time. They were inside the graveyard. I held my breath. My mind raced. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. A long silence followed. Then, something pressed against the fabric. A shape just barely visible through the thin material. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. I lay there for what felt like forever, heart pounding. I couldn't bring myself to move. At some point, exhaustion won. My body shut down, dragging me into a restless sleep. When I woke up, the fire was out. The air was colder than before, damp and heavy. I unzipped the tent slowly, peeking out. The graveyard looked the same as it had the night before, silent, still. But something was different. The ground around my tent had been disturbed. Footprints. They circled the tent, some leading toward the trees, others vanishing into the tall grass. My stomach twisted. I packed up my things as fast as I could, my hands shaking. Every second felt like I was being watched. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to think. I just grabbed my gear and left. By the time I reached my truck, my nerves were shot. I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror as I drove away. The graveyard disappeared behind me, swallowed by the trees. I didn't look back again, and I never went back. I never liked camping much. My wife, Rebecca, on the other hand, loved it. She grew up with a father who took her hunting and fishing, taught her to track animals, and made her feel at home in the wilderness. It was different for me. I wasn't raised that way. I liked knowing that if something went wrong, I could call for help and someone would show up. But Rebecca was a cop. More than that, she was tough, capable, and confident. So when she told me she had a few days off and wanted to go deep into the woods, just the two of us, I couldn't say no. She picked the spot, someplace far out in the forests of Washington, near an old trailhead she used to go to as a kid. It wasn't an official campsite. There was no ranger station, no marked trails, no other people around. Just trees, dirt, and the cold air of early autumn. I wasn't thrilled, but I told myself it would be fine. We had plenty of supplies, a good tent, and Rebecca had brought her duty weapon just in case. The drive took us nearly 6 hours. First on highways, then winding back roads, then finally a long stretch of uneven dirt that seemed to go on forever. By the time we reached a good place to set up camp, the sun was already getting low. The trees were tall and thick, and the air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. It was beautiful, I had to admit, but something about it made me uneasy. We pitched the tent near a small clearing, with just enough open space for a fire. Rebecca made quick work of setting up, while I gathered some wood. The quiet was unsettling. No distant hum of traffic, no sounds of people. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals. By the time we had a fire going and some food cooked, night had fully settled in. The darkness was thick, pressing in from all sides. Our little fire seemed small against the vastness of the woods. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like something was just beyond the reach of the light. Rebecca noticed. "You all right?" she asked, though I could tell she wasn't too concerned. She was comfortable here. I wasn't. I nodded and forced a smile. "Just not used to it." She smirked, but didn't push. We sat in silence for a while, eating, listening to the fire crackle. The stars were out, bright and endless. It should have been peaceful. Then, somewhere off in the trees, a branch snapped. It wasn't a small twig, not the sound of a raccoon or rabbit scurrying through the underbrush. It was something bigger, something that took deliberate steps. My stomach tightened. Rebecca's posture shifted instantly. She was calm but alert. She set her plate down slowly, listening. Another step, then another. It was hard to tell how far away it was. The trees' distorted sound made it hard to judge distance. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to convince myself more than anything. Rebecca didn't respond. She just stared into the darkness, waiting. After a few moments, the sound stopped. The woods went quiet again. Too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves. Just silence. It stretched on for what felt like forever. Finally, Rebecca exhaled and shook her head. "Could be anything," she said, more to herself than me. But I could tell she wasn't convinced. We finished eating, put the fire down to embers, and climbed into the tent. Rebecca kept her gun within arm's reach, tucked just beside her sleeping bag. I lay there for a long time, listening. Every little noise felt magnified. I could hear the wind, the occasional creak of tree branches, but nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, soft, slow footsteps, just outside the tent. Not an animal. Not the clumsy, erratic movement of a deer or bear. These were careful, deliberate, human. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps circled the tent once, then stopped. I could feel my heart hammering. Whoever it was, they were just standing there, inches from the thin fabric separating us. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Rebecca. She was already awake, eyes open, body tense. She had one hand on her gun. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. Slow, steady, fading into the trees. Neither of us moved for a long time. Then, barely above a whisper, Rebecca said, "Stay here." Before I could even think to argue, she was up, gun in hand, unzipping the tent as quietly as possible. She stepped out into the night, silent, controlled. I stayed where I was, every muscle in my body locked up. I listened as she took a few careful steps away. Then more silence. Minutes passed. Then I heard her voice, low and firm. "Come out. Now." Pause. Then something moving. "Who are you?" she asked. No response. A few more seconds, then footsteps. Fast, retreating into the forest. I heard Rebecca take a few steps after them, but she didn't follow. Then she was back. She zipped up the tent, sat down beside me, gun still in her hand. "It was a man," she said after a long moment. Didn't see his face. He was just standing there. My skin crawled. What did he do? Nothing, she said. Just watching. Neither of us slept after that. We kept the fire going the rest of the night, watching the trees, waiting. But whoever it was didn't come back. The first light, we packed up. We didn't talk much. There was no question of staying another night. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the time we reached the car and started driving, I felt like I could breathe again. But as we pulled onto the main road, I noticed something. On the dirt, just a few feet from where we had parked, there were footprints. Not ours. They led from the trees, stopped near the car, then turned back. Whoever it was had been watching us before we even set up camp. I never went camping again. It was late October, right before the cold set in for good. The leaves were thick on the ground, the kind that crunched under your boots, and the air had that damp smell of decay. I had taken a week off work to go deep into the woods for a hunting trip. Just me, my rifle, and my gear. I'd been planning it for months, mapping out the area, checking reports of game movement, making sure I had the right supplies. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise of people, the stress of work, everything. I'd done this before several times, but this time would be different. I drove for hours before I reached the old logging road. It wasn't marked on newer maps, but I had found it years ago, a forgotten stretch of dirt and rocks that led deep into a forest few people ever set foot in. I had to park miles away from my intended camping spot, the rest of the way on foot. That was part of the appeal. If you could drive all the way in, it meant too many people had been there. I wanted to be in real wilderness, somewhere untouched, where the animals still behaved like animals, not half-tame creatures used to seeing humans. The hike was rough. My pack was heavy, loaded with enough supplies to last me a week, plus my rifle slung over my shoulder. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became. No road noise, no hum of distant civilization. Just the wind through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot, and the rustling of unseen creatures moving in the undergrowth. That was the best part of it. The silence. I reached my planned camping spot just before dusk. It was a small clearing, not too exposed, with a good view of the valley below. The tree cover was thick enough to keep me hidden, but not so dense that it blocked the sky. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and sat back to watch the sunset. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the distant hoots of owls, and went to sleep early, knowing I'd be up before dawn to start tracking. The second day started as any good hunting trip should. I woke in the dark, packed up what I needed, and moved quietly through the trees. The cold bit at my fingers as I gripped my rifle, and every breath came out in a mist. I tracked fresh deer sign, found a good position, and waited. Hours passed. That's the thing about hunting. It's mostly waiting. You sit there, still as a rock, listening, watching. The forest moves around you, barely noticing you're there. By midday, I finally had some luck. A buck, big and healthy, moved into the clearing about 70 yards away. I lined up my shot, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shattered the stillness. The deer jumped, stumbled, and ran. I waited a few minutes before following, making sure I didn't push it too soon. Tracking a wounded animal isn't easy. Even with a clean shot, they can run for quite a while. I found a good blood trail, dark red drops against the yellow leaves, and started following. The terrain got rougher, sloping down into thick brush. I moved slowly, carefully, scanning ahead for movement. Then I found something that made me stop. A second blood trail. It wasn't from the deer. It was fresh, smeared on the leaves, leading off in a different direction. That didn't make sense. I'd only fired one shot. There shouldn't have been another wounded animal. My first thought was that maybe a predator had been nearby, maybe a cougar or a bear, and had gotten itself caught in the crossfire. But I hadn't seen anything else when I took the shot. I stood there for a long time listening. The forest felt different now, too quiet.
No birds, no rustling.
Just stillness. I should have left it alone. I should have kept tracking the deer, gotten my kill, and gone back to camp. But something about that second blood trail got under my skin. It looked different, thicker, smeared, like whatever was bleeding had been moving slow, maybe dragging itself. I followed it. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The blood was heavier now, staining the ground in big, dark patches. The trees were thick, closing in around me, and the undergrowth was dense, making every step an effort. I started seeing broken branches, signs of struggle. Something had gone through here in a bad way. Then I found the first piece of fabric. It was caught on a branch, dark and stiff with dried blood. At first, I thought maybe a poacher had been injured, maybe someone hunting illegally, but the further I went, the less that made sense. The blood wasn't old, hadn't been there long. Then I smelled it, that thick, coppery stink of blood and something worse. Rot. I should have turned back. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I kept going, my rifle raised, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I saw it, a boot, half buried in the leaves. Not just any boot. An old, worn-out hiking boot, laces undone, the leather cracked with age. And it wasn't empty. The foot inside was swollen, discolored. The leg ended just below the knee, torn, ragged flesh where something had ripped it apart. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. My brain tried to make sense of it. An animal attack? Maybe. But why was the rest of the body nowhere in sight? I scanned the trees, every shadow suddenly looking like a threat. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get back to camp, to get out of those woods. I turned, ready to move, when I heard it, a rustling, close. I froze. My grip tightened on my rifle. Then, through the trees, I saw movement. Not an animal, not a bear, a man. He was standing there, half hidden in the shadows, watching me. His clothes were filthy, torn, stained with something dark. His face was wrong, gaunt, hollowed-out eyes, sunken cheeks. His hands were shaking, but he didn't move. I raised my rifle. He didn't react. Then he took a step forward. Slow, deliberate. I backed up, my breath coming fast now. My mind screamed at me to run, but I held my ground, my rifle locked on him. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was wrong, stretched too wide, too unnatural. I turned and ran. I crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at my face. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. When I reached my campsite, I grabbed my pack, shoved everything inside in a panic, and started moving. I didn't stop. I hiked back the way I came, my rifle in one hand, my other gripping my knife. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. When I finally looked back, the woods were still. But I knew he was there, watching. I never went back. I had always liked camping, though I wouldn't call myself an expert. I wasn't one of those guys who packed ultralight gear and trekked deep into the wild for weeks, but I knew my way around the basics. I had a decent tent, a good sleeping bag, and enough common sense to stay safe. In the summer of 2017, I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and I felt the need to get away from everything. I picked a spot about 3 hours from home, a quiet, lesser-known area in the mountains where I wouldn't have to deal with crowds. It wasn't a fully remote area, But it also wasn't one of those overdeveloped campgrounds with paved roads and picnic tables. Just a dirt path leading into the woods, a few scattered fire rings, and nothing else. It was the kind of place where you might see another camper's tent through the trees if you looked hard enough, but you'd probably never hear them. I arrived in the afternoon and parked at the end of the dirt road. My pack wasn't too heavy, and the hike to the campsite was only about a mile. It was a warm day, the kind where the heat sinks into your skin, but there was a breeze moving through the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air. I took my time walking, enjoying the quiet. The campsite I chose was perfect. Flat ground, a good clearing, and a fallen log that would make a decent bench near the fire ring. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood before it got dark. As the sun started to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The forest was peaceful, the kind of place where your only company was the sound of the wind moving through the leaves. I didn't see any animals except for a few birds and a squirrel that watched me from a tree branch. It was exactly what I needed, a break from the noise of everyday life. The first night was uneventful. I lay in my tent, listening to the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I had camped enough to know that most sounds in the woods come from small creatures. Rabbits, raccoons, or even just the wind shifting branches. I drifted off to sleep easily. It was the second night when things started to feel off. That day, I spent my time exploring. I hiked further into the woods, following an old game trail. There was no real destination, I just liked the feeling of wandering. After a few hours, I found a small stream and filled my water bottle. The sun was high, and I sat on a rock for a while, letting the cool air off the water dry the sweat on my skin. That's when I noticed it. A sound. Not close, but not far either. A snap like a branch breaking. It wasn't a small twig either. It was loud, the kind of noise something big would make if it stepped on a dry limb. I froze, listening. Silence. I scanned the trees, looking for movement, but everything was still. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a bear. Black bears were common enough in the area, but they weren't aggressive unless provoked. Still, something about it unsettled me. I had been in the woods all day and hadn't seen so much as a deer track. Now, suddenly, something big was nearby. I waited another minute, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, the stream, and the occasional rustle of leaves. Eventually, I shrugged it off and started heading back to camp. By the time I got back, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I built another fire and ate my dinner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the kind of paranoia that sneaks up on you when you're alone in the woods. The fire burned low, and I climbed into my tent. I lay there for a long time listening to the night. The usual sounds were there, the wind, the insects, the occasional distant owl. But something was missing. The underbrush was silent. That was what bothered me. Normally, you hear little creatures moving around at night. Mice, rabbits, raccoons. But the woods were completely still. It was around midnight when I heard it again. A snap. Closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. I lay there, perfectly still, my ears straining. Another snap. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't random. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Moving through the trees just beyond my campsite. I reached for my knife. I always kept it close when I camped, not because I expected trouble, but because it was a good habit. I gripped it tightly, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. I didn't move. I don't know how long I stayed like that. 5 minutes, 10, maybe longer. Eventually, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. The wind, a falling branch, something normal. But then a sound. Soft. Breathing. Not mine. Just outside my tent. My stomach turned to ice. I had never been so aware of my own breathing. how loud it sounded in the silence. I didn't move. The breathing stayed there for what felt like forever. Slow, steady, then footsteps, moving away, not quickly, not running, just walking, the way a person walks when they're not in a hurry. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, gripping my knife, listening. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew I wasn't alone. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my gear. I didn't bother eating. I didn't even fully collapse my tent. I just stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could. The walk back to my car felt longer than it should have. Every sound put me on edge. The wind through the branches, the rustle of leaves. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but I never saw anything. I made it to my car, threw my pack in the back, and got in. I locked the doors before I even started the engine. I didn't relax until I was miles away, back on the main road, the trees disappearing in my rearview mirror. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I was not alone. I never planned to camp alone, but things don't always go the way you expect. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. My friend Mark and I had picked a remote spot in the forests of Montana, far from any towns or even well-traveled trails. He had to back out at the last minute because of work, but I decided to go anyway. I had all the gear I needed. I had been camping for years, and I figured a few nights alone in the wilderness would do me some good. I arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon and hiked for several miles until I found a clearing near a small creek. The spot was perfect, flat ground, plenty of firewood, and no sign of other campers. It was quiet, the kind of quiet you only get deep in the wilderness. The wind moved through the trees, and every now and then, I heard the distant sound of running water. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and got a fire going before it got dark. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food over the fire, listened to the sounds of the forest, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. I slept well, only waking up once when a raccoon rustled around near my tent. In the morning, I made coffee, ate breakfast, and decided to do some exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, taking in the scenery. The forest was dense, but I wasn't worried about getting lost. I had a GPS and had marked my camp's location. As I walked, I noticed something strange. The trees ahead of me had deep scratches in them, long and jagged. It looked like something had been clawing at them. I stopped and took a closer look. The marks were too high up for a coyote or a mountain lion. Maybe a bear, I thought. That was unsettling, but not enough to make me turn back. I was carrying bear spray and a knife, and I knew the basics of dealing with wildlife. I kept moving. I found something else a little further along, a small pile of bones. They were stripped clean, white against the forest floor, probably the remains of a deer. The sight made me uneasy, but again, I told myself it was just nature running its course. I took a few pictures, then turned back toward camp. As I walked, I started to feel strange. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something felt wrong. The forest seemed quieter than before. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. I picked up my pace. The feeling didn't go away, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. When I got back to camp, I checked my surroundings carefully. Nothing was out of place. My tent was untouched, my gear right where I left it. I forced myself to relax. I made lunch, read for a while, and chopped some more wood. By the time the sun started to set, I had convinced myself that I had just let my imagination get the best of me. That night, I woke up to a sound. A single, sharp crack like a branch breaking. My eyes snapped open and I lay still, listening. Nothing. Then, a few moments later, another sound. Closer, a rustling, then silence again. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow around the clearing. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. Still, my heart was pounding. I stayed like that for a long time, barely breathing, waiting. But whatever it was, it didn't make another sound. After a while, I convinced myself it had just been an animal passing through. I zipped the tent back up and tried to sleep. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Human tracks. They weren't mine. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the edge of my camp, then back into the woods. Someone had been here while I slept. I felt a deep, cold dread settle in my stomach. I had been alone all this time, or at least I thought I had been. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw no sign of anyone. I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear quickly, throwing everything into my pack. My plan had been to stay another night, but that wasn't happening. I was getting out. I started down the trail, moving fast but trying to stay quiet. My ears were on high alert, listening for any sound of movement behind me. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hike back to my truck felt twice as long as it had on the way in. Every time I turned a corner or passed through a thick stretch of trees, I expected to see someone standing there. When I finally reached the parking area, my truck was just as I left it. I threw my pack in the back and got inside, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I pulled onto the dirt road and drove away. I don't know who was out there. Maybe just some other camper, maybe a hunter. But I can't shake the feeling that they weren't just passing through. They had been watching me, and they had waited until I was asleep to come closer. I haven't been camping alone since. I never thought much about camping alone. It was something I had done plenty of times before, and it had always been peaceful. I liked the quiet, the break from everything. No phone service, no city noise, no distractions. Just the trees, the wind, the crackling fire. This trip was no different. I had driven out to a remote part of the woods in northern Michigan, far from any designated campground, where I knew I wouldn't see another soul. I preferred it that way. I had my tent, my gear, enough food for a few days. I set up by a small clearing not too far from a narrow river. The trees were dense, towering overhead, their branches reaching so high they blocked out most of the sky. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves or the chirping of birds. I spent the first afternoon setting up camp, gathering firewood, making sure everything was in place. I always followed the same routine: keep everything organized, stay prepared. I wasn't worried about animals, this wasn't bear country, but I still kept my food locked away and my knife within reach. It was a habit, nothing more. That first night was quiet. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the wind move through the trees. I had a book with me, but I didn't read much. I just sat there, enjoying the stillness, the solitude. When I finally crawled into my tent and lay down in my sleeping bag, I felt completely at ease. I woke up to something moving outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest crunch of leaves, the smallest disturbance in the night. I lay still, listening. Animals moved through the woods all the time, raccoons, deer, maybe a fox. But this didn't sound like an animal. It was slow, deliberate. A single footstep, then another, then silence. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding. The fire had died down to embers, and my tent was zipped shut. I had no way of seeing outside. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly, listening. Nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I strained my ears, waiting for another sound. But there was nothing. No wind, no insects, no movement, just silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe I had imagined it. I told myself it didn't matter. I was in the middle of nowhere. No one else should be out here. I tried to sleep, but it took a long time before I finally drifted off. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and looked around. Everything seemed normal. My gear was undisturbed. Nothing had been touched, but something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there the night before. I decided to stay an extra day. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't spooked, that I wasn't being paranoid. I spent the morning hiking, following the river upstream, taking in the crisp air. The woods were beautiful, untouched. No signs of other people.
No footprints. No campsites.
By the time I got back to camp, the sun was starting to set. I built up the fire again, ate my dinner, and sat in the same spot as the night before. But this time I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. Hours passed. The fire burned low. The air got colder. Eventually, I forced myself to crawl into my tent and lie down. I didn't sleep. I don't know what time it was when I heard it again. A footstep, closer this time, then another. I gripped my knife so tight my hand hurt. I waited, barely breathing. Silence. Then something brushed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just a faint touch. A slow, deliberate press. I shot up, heart hammering, trying to stay quiet. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it at the fabric. Nothing. I turned it off, listening, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Then I heard it. A long, slow exhale, right outside my tent. Not an animal. Person. I felt my blood turn to ice. My grip on the knife tightened. I waited. Then, slowly, the footsteps moved away. I don't know how long I sat there in the darkness, listening, waiting for them to come back. But they didn't. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I did was check around my tent. There were footprints. Human. They circled my tent, stopped by the fire, then disappeared into the woods. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't eat, didn't rest. I shoved everything into my backpack and started hiking back toward my truck. The entire way I felt watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but I never did. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear inside and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trees, waiting for someone to step out. Nothing did. I started the engine and drove away. I never went back to that spot again. I set up camp just before sunset, deep in the woods where the trees grew thick and the undergrowth tangled at my feet. The forecast had called for rain, but I wasn't worried. I had packed accordingly: waterproof tarp, a sturdy tent, extra clothes, and enough food to last a couple of days. I had done this countless times before, camping alone in remote areas where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant calls of birds. I liked the isolation. I liked the quiet. This time, I had chosen a spot near a small clearing, not too far from a narrow dirt road that barely passed for a trail. I had driven my truck as far as it would go before the road became too rough, then hiked in about 2 miles with my gear. I wanted to be far enough from any signs of civilization, but still within a reasonable walking distance if something went wrong. The air was already thick with humidity, and the sky had taken on a dull gray hue, signaling the coming rain. I worked quickly, setting up my tent and securing the tarp above it, angling it so the water would run off to the side instead of pooling on top. The ground was dry for now, but I knew that wouldn't last. I gathered firewood before the rain started, stacking it under the tarp to keep it from getting soaked. I had no cell service out here. That was part of the reason I came, to disconnect, to be away from everything. But it also meant that if something happened, I was on my own. I didn't think much of it. I had been doing this for years, and nothing had ever gone seriously wrong. By the time the first raindrops began to fall, I had a fire going and was heating up a can of chili. The smell of it mixed with the damp earth, the scent of wet pine and smoke. The sound of rain tapping against the tarp was oddly comforting, a steady rhythm that filled the silence. I sat there, eating straight from the can, watching the fire dance in the dimming light. The rain picked up, coming down harder, but I was dry under my tarp. It was a good setup. I felt safe. But then I heard something. It wasn't the rain, wasn't the wind. It was something else. A sound just on the edge of my hearing. A crack, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I looked up, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The trees were dense, their trunks blending together into a black wall. I squinted, trying to see past the shifting shadows. Maybe it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but something about it didn't feel right. I sat still, listening. The rain drowned out the smaller noises, but I swore I heard something moving. Slow, deliberate, not the quick, erratic movements of an animal. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, just wet bark and thick undergrowth. I exhaled, shaking my head at myself. I was being paranoid. I turned off the flashlight and leaned back, forcing myself to relax. The fire crackled, the rain fell, and everything was fine. But then I heard it again, closer, a distinct crunch, like a footstep sinking into damp leaves. My heart picked up speed. I sat up straighter, eyes locked on the dark. The fire's glow barely reached past my tent, leaving the rest of the forest in shadows. I listened, straining to hear past the rain, and then nothing. No more footsteps, no more rustling, just the steady drumming of rain against my tarp. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a tree limb had snapped under the weight of the water. Maybe I was imagining things, but my gut told me otherwise. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight again, this time holding it tighter. I didn't turn it on yet. I just stood there, waiting, staring into the woods. My breath was slow, controlled. I didn't want to make any sudden movements. The rain made it harder to hear, but I kept listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I let out a breath and sat back down. Then, just as I reached for my drink, something moved. Closer this time. My stomach clenched. I flicked on the flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. A figure. For a split second, I saw it tall just at the edge of the trees. But as soon as the light hit it, it moved. Quick. Too quick. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. I pointed the flashlight back, but it was gone. The woods were empty. I swallowed hard. My first thought was that it was another camper, but no one else should have been out here. Not this deep. Not in this rain. I scanned the trees again, my grip tightening around the flashlight. Nothing moved, but I knew what I had seen. I forced myself to breathe. My mind ran through my options. I could pack up and leave, but hiking back in the dark, in the rain, wasn't safe. My truck was miles away. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just someone passing through. Maybe they hadn't even seen me, but that didn't explain the way they moved. I kept the flashlight in my hand, sat back down, and kept the fire going. If someone was out there, I wanted them to know I was awake, alert. The rain didn't let up. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway, their branches creaking. Hours passed. I didn't sleep. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I turned the flashlight on, aiming it toward the sound, but again, nothing, just empty trees. I stayed awake until the sky began to lighten. The rain had stopped by then, leaving everything soaked. I packed up quickly, every muscle in my body tense. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my truck was the longest I had ever done. Every step I felt watched. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, but I knew. I knew something had been out there. I reached my truck just as the sun started breaking through the clouds. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back toward the tree line, and that's when I saw it, standing just beyond the trees, half hidden in the shadows. Watching me, I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just drove, and I never went back. I always enjoyed camping alone. There was something about being out in the woods, away from people, away from the noise of everyday life, that made me feel at peace. I wasn't the kind of person who needed company to enjoy myself. I liked the quiet, the way the forest moved and breathed around me. I'd done it dozens of times before, setting off with my pack and rifle, heading deep into the trees where no one else went. This time was no different. It was early October, just cool enough to be comfortable but not cold enough to need heavy gear. I had planned a week-long trip in a national forest in northern Montana, near the Canadian border. The area was remote. No cell service, no ranger stations nearby, just miles and miles of untouched wilderness. That's how I liked it. I had checked the weather before heading out, made sure my pack was fully stocked, and set off in my truck early in the morning, driving nearly 3 hours from the nearest town before turning onto an unmarked dirt road. The road was rough, barely more than 2 tire tracks cutting through the trees, but my truck handled it fine. I drove for another 20 minutes before stopping at a small clearing beside a creek. From there, I would hike. I parked, got my gear together, and locked up the truck. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, my pack strapped tight against my back. The weight was familiar, comforting. I knew everything I needed was inside: food, water, a tent, extra clothes, first aid kit, my hunting knife. I double-checked it all before stepping onto the trail, then started walking. The first few hours passed easily. The forest was dense, mostly pine and spruce, with the occasional clearing where sunlight broke through the canopy. The air smelled clean, fresh, the way only the deep woods do. Birds called from the branches, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a woodpecker hammering against a tree. I walked until late afternoon, then found a good spot to set up camp. A small, flat stretch of ground near a stream, surrounded by thick trees. It was well hidden, out of sight from any trails or game paths. I cleared a space for my tent, set up my small fire ring, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I cooked a simple meal over the fire, just some canned beans and jerky. The night was quiet, peaceful. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the trees in the wind. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped up my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow against the fabric of my tent. Everything was still, silent, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I listened. Nothing. No wind.
No insects.
No movement in the trees. Then I heard it. A single, sharp snap. Somewhere close. Too close. It wasn't the sound of a branch breaking under its own weight. It was something stepping on it. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. My rifle was outside, leaning against a tree next to the fire. My knife was under my sleeping bag. I slowly reached for it, gripping the handle tight. The sound didn't come again. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, ears straining, waiting for another noise. But the forest remained silent. Finally, after what must have been an hour, I let my grip loosen and forced myself to relax. Could have been anything, a deer, a bear, even a raccoon. Animals passed through campsites all the time. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came slow. The sky was overcast, gray clouds blocking out the sun. I got up, stretched, and checked around camp. Nothing looked disturbed. I made coffee over the fire, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to go for a hike. I spent most of the day moving through the forest, taking my rifle with me in case I spotted anything worth hunting. But I never fired a shot. The woods were oddly empty. I didn't see any deer, no fresh tracks, nothing. Even the birds were quieter than usual. That feeling of being watched stuck with me all day. By the time I made it back to camp, I was exhausted. I had covered nearly 10 miles, circling back along a ridgeline that overlooked the valley. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. I gathered more firewood, made dinner, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. The night passed the same way. Silence, stillness, then the sound of something moving in the trees. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out. I packed up camp, made sure the fire was out, and started hiking back to my truck. I moved fast, covering the ground in half the time it had taken me to get in. The whole time, I felt like something was behind me, just out of sight. Then, about a mile from my truck, I saw them. Footprints, not mine, fresh, deep. Someone had been following me. I gripped my rifle tighter and kept moving. When I reached the clearing where I had left my truck, my stomach dropped. The truck was still there, but the driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. I stepped closer, heart hammering in my chest. The inside was a mess. My glove compartment open, papers scattered. My spare water bottles were missing, and so was my emergency kit. But the keys were still in the center console. Whoever had been here hadn't wanted the truck. They had wanted me to come back to it. I didn't hesitate. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel kicked up as I spun the tires, tearing out of the clearing faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop. Not until I hit pavement. Not until I saw houses and power lines and other people. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. And I don't ever want to find out. There's something about the deep woods that makes people disappear. Some folks think it's wild animals. Some think it's just people getting lost. But I know better. Sometimes something else is out there, watching, waiting. I hadn't been camping since she passed. My wife used to be the one who packed everything. She made sure we had the right gear, the right food, the right maps. I just carried the heavy stuff and set up the fire. But now it was just me, standing in my garage, looking at our old camping equipment like it belonged to someone else. The tent was still rolled up in its bag, dusty from years of disuse. The sleeping bags smelled faintly of her shampoo. It had been 2 years. 2 years of an empty house. 2 years of coming home to silence. I thought camping again might help, at least for a weekend. It was something we used to love, something that made us feel alive. Maybe it would help me feel something again. I picked a place far from town, somewhere quiet. I didn't want to run into families or couples out hiking. I just wanted to be alone. The spot I chose was about a 5-hour drive from home, deep in the woods near an old, abandoned logging site. There was a lake nearby and a long, winding trail that stretched for miles in either direction. The perfect place to disappear for a while. The drive was long but familiar. Winding roads, tall trees, the occasional glimpse of a river through the gaps in the forest. It reminded me of all the times we'd done this together, stopping for gas, picking up snacks, arguing about which road to take. But now it was just me and the radio playing songs I didn't really hear. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, thick with gray clouds that promised rain but never delivered. The air smelled like damp earth, rich and clean. I found a clearing off the main dirt road, far enough into the woods that I wouldn't be disturbed, but not so far that I couldn't find my way back. Setting up camp was harder than I remembered. The tent didn't seem to want to go up right. The firewood I gathered was damp. The wind kept shifting, making it hard to get the flames going. By the time I had everything settled, the sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I ate a simple meal, canned beans, some bread, a bottle of water. It wasn't the same without her. She used to cook over the fire, making things that actually tasted good. I just ate for the sake of eating. The first night was uneventful. Just the sounds of the forest, crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Normal things, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving outside the tent. Probably just animals, but it kept me on edge. The second day, I decided to hike. The trail stretched deep into the woods, winding through old trees with thick trunks covered in moss. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that settled deep in your lungs. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift, trying to enjoy the quiet. But there was this feeling I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the trees. But there was nothing, just the woods, stretching endlessly in every direction. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my nerves, to being alone out here for the first time in years. Then I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but the more I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were bigger, deeper, like someone heavier had walked the same path. And they weren't old. The edges were still crisp, not softened by wind or rain. Someone else had been here. I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just this thick, heavy silence that made my skin crawl. I turned back. I walked faster than before, my heart pounding. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, but I never heard anything. Still, that feeling didn't go away. That sense of being watched, of something just out of sight. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low again, the sky painted in dull shades of orange and pink. I checked around my tent, looking for any signs that someone had been there, but everything seemed untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I kept the fire burning bright. I sat by the flames, staring into the trees, listening to the night. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, just a shadow shifting between the trunks, gone too fast to be sure. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. But then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A branch snapped, not far, maybe 30, 40 feet from my tent. I froze, every muscle tensed. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air, but I didn't move. Another snap, closer this time. I grabbed the hatchet I'd brought, holding it tight. My breath was shallow, controlled. I listened. Silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, waiting. By morning, I felt sick with exhaustion. My head ached. My body was sluggish. But I didn't want to stay another night. I started packing. Fast. Then I noticed the footprints. Not mine. Not from the day before. Fresh ones. Leading from the trees right up to my campfire. Then back into the woods. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I threw everything into my truck, barely securing the gear before speeding down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't slow down, not until I was miles away, back on the highway, where the trees finally thinned and the sun felt warm again. I didn't look back. I haven't been camping since. I still think about it, though, about those footprints, about that feeling of being watched, and about the fact that, in all my time out there, I never heard anyone leave. I had been hunting all my life. My father taught me, just as his father had taught him. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about the land, the patience, the stillness of the woods. I was never one for city life, never needed crowds or noise. I preferred the sound of wind pushing through the trees, the snap of a twig under a buck's hoof, the distant cry of some unseen animal in the dark. That was the life I knew. That's why I found myself out in the deep woods of Montana, miles away from any town, in the fall of 2018. I had scouted the area before: thick forests, rolling hills, a quiet lake with a narrow stream feeding into it. The kind of place that felt untouched. A place where the modern world didn't reach. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed light but smart. My rifle, a .308 Winchester, reliable and familiar. A good hunting knife. Enough food to last a week, though I planned to catch my own meals when possible. A tent, a sleeping bag, and all the essentials. I parked my truck off an old logging road and hiked deep into the woods, far enough that no one would stumble upon my camp. The first day was simple: set up camp, scout the area, get a feel for the land. There were deer tracks near the stream, fresh ones. A few signs of black bears, but nothing to worry about. The woods were silent except for the usual sounds: birds, wind, the rustle of leaves. Felt right. That night, I built a small fire and cooked up some venison jerky I had brought with me. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I listened to the sounds of the forest, felt the stillness settle in around me. There was nothing out here but me and the wild. The second day, I started tracking. I moved slow, careful, scanning the ground for fresh tracks. The deer were close, and I followed their trail deeper into the trees. I walked for hours, rifle in hand, senses sharp. Then, around midday, I spotted one. A big buck, standing near the edge of a clearing, head low, grazing. I raised my rifle, steadying my breath. Just as I was about to squeeze the trigger, the buck's head snapped up. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me into the woods. Its ears twitched, its muscles tensed. Then, without warning, it bolted. Gone in seconds. I stayed completely still, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, just the usual rustling of leaves. But there was something else, something faint. A sound I couldn't quite place. Like movement, but slower, more deliberate. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But that feeling, the one every hunter knows, the feeling of being watched. It was there. I stayed for a while, trying to shake it off. Maybe it was just a bear moving through the woods, or some other animal. Still, I kept my rifle ready as I made my way back to camp. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something, a rustling too close, a faint snap of a twig. I kept my knife close, my rifle even closer. But when morning came, everything was quiet again. I told myself I was being paranoid. The third day, I went deeper into the woods. I followed a fresh set of tracks, leading me to a small ridge overlooking the valley. The view was incredible, miles of untouched wilderness stretching into the horizon. But then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tent. It was old, weathered. A single-person setup, half collapsed. At first, I thought maybe it was from another hunter who had left it behind, but as I got closer, I saw the state of it. Torn fabric, a rusted zipper, scattered gear, half buried under leaves. It had been there a long time. Then I saw the knife. It was stabbed into a nearby tree, rusted, weathered like the tent. But the way it was stuck there, it wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A message. I felt that same sensation again. That feeling of being watched. I didn't stay. I backed away, keeping my rifle raised, and made my way back toward camp. My pace quickened. The silence of the woods felt wrong now, too thick. Every instinct told me to leave, to get back to my truck and go. When I reached my camp, I stopped dead. My gear was scattered. My tent was slashed open. My backpack, which I had left zipped, was torn apart. My food gone. But the firewood I had stacked was untouched. My rifle, which I had taken with me, was the only thing I had left intact. Someone had been here. Someone was watching. I forced myself to stay calm. I gathered what was left of my things and packed up fast. I wasn't going to spend another night here. I started moving, heading straight for where I had left my truck. It would be a long hike, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. As I moved through the trees, I kept looking back. I knew better than to let paranoia take over, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The woods were too quiet. Then I saw it. A figure, just for a second between the trees. Too far to make out any details, but close enough to know it was a person. Standing still, watching. I didn't hesitate. I moved faster, rifle in hand, heart pounding. The hike back felt endless. Every rustle, every snap of a branch sent my pulse racing. But I never saw the figure again. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was starting to set. I threw my gear into the back and got in, locking the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, breathing hard. Then, just as I turned the key, I noticed something in my side mirror. A figure, standing at the tree line, not moving. I didn't wait. I started the truck, slammed it into reverse, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't look back. I never reported it. Never went back. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm out hunting somewhere new, deep in the woods, and I get that feeling, that sense that I'm not alone, I remember that night, and I keep moving. I never liked camping in the rain, but sometimes plans don't go the way you want. I had set out for a 3-day trip in the woods, hoping for some peace and quiet away from the noise of life. It wasn't anything fancy, just a solo trip to clear my head. I wasn't new to the outdoors, and I had done my fair share of solo camping before. I had packed light but smart, bringing along a sturdy tent, plenty of food, a good sleeping bag, and the essentials to make sure I stayed dry and warm. The forecast had called for light showers, but by the time I made it to my spot, a small clearing near a shallow creek, it was obvious that the weather was going to be worse than expected. The sky had turned a dull, heavy gray, and the wind had started to pick up, pushing through the trees in restless bursts. Still, I wasn't too worried. I had camped through bad weather before. I found a good flat spot, cleared away some debris, and set up my tent before the rain got too heavy. The wind rattled the trees, and now and then, I could hear branches snapping somewhere off in the distance. It was eerie, sure, but nothing that set off any real alarm bells. By the time I had finished securing my tent, the rain had started coming down harder. The sound of it hitting the nylon fabric was steady, and the wind made the whole thing shake now and then, but I had staked it down well. I crawled inside, zipped it up, and settled in for the night. I wasn't tired yet, so I pulled out my flashlight and my old paperback. The sound of the rain outside was almost comforting. It drowned out the usual forest noises, the rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl, the snapping of twigs from unseen movements in the trees. I don't know how long I sat there, reading by flashlight, listening to the rain. An hour? Maybe 2? The temperature had dropped, and I had wrapped my sleeping bag around me, leaning back against my backpack when I heard it. At first, I wasn't even sure I had actually heard something. Just a noise beneath the rain, faint and distant. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't the wind moving through the trees. It was something else, something moving. I turned off my flashlight and sat still, holding my breath. The rain kept coming down, steady and heavy, but I could still hear it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the hurried movement of a deer, not the light scurrying of a raccoon. It was someone. The sound stopped. For a long moment, I just sat there, barely breathing. My mind ran through all the possibilities. Maybe another camper, a hiker who got lost, but who would be wandering through the woods in the middle of a downpour, this late at night? I listened. The rain masked a lot of sounds, but I was sure now. There was someone out there, close by. The sound of footsteps had been distinct, cutting through the noise of the storm. I reached for my knife. It wasn't much, just a sturdy hunting knife I always brought along for emergencies. I felt the weight of it in my hand and tried to calm my breathing. Then, just when I thought maybe I had imagined it, I heard something new, a soft scraping sound. It was coming from the side of my tent. Something or someone was touching the fabric. I gripped my knife tighter and stayed completely still. The scraping stopped. A long silence followed, filled only with the sound of rain. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had imagined it, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were moving away. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, 20. I didn't move, didn't even shift my weight. The rain had soaked the ground outside, and I knew if I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I'd be making noise. I waited longer. Nothing. The wind picked up again, rattling the trees, but I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I didn't hear anything except the rain. After what must have been an hour, I finally let myself breathe normally again. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. The rain, the darkness, it could mess with your senses. I lay back, gripping my knife, and eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. I woke up suddenly, my heart hammering. The rain had stopped. The silence was thick, pressing in on me. I strained my ears, listening, but the forest was still. Too still. The usual sounds of the night, bugs, distant owls, the rustling of leaves were gone. Then, from just outside my tent, I heard breathing. Deep, slow, measured. Not an animal. Someone was standing outside my tent. I didn't move. My mind was racing. My grip on my knife so tight my knuckles ached. The breathing stayed steady for a moment longer. Then the footsteps started again. Slow, heavy, moving around the tent, circling it. I stayed frozen. The footsteps stopped at the entrance. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then the zipper moved. A single inch, then another. I didn't think. I lashed out with my knife, driving it toward the noise with all the force I had. A sharp grunt, the sound of something stumbling back. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent fully, and threw myself outside, ready to fight. Nothing. The forest was empty. The ground was wet. The trees swayed in the wind, but there was no one there. My breath came fast and hard. I shone my flashlight in shaking arcs around me, searching, but the woods were empty. Then I saw it. A single, deep footprint in the mud, and next to it a smear of blood. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my gear and ran. I didn't pack, didn't care about my tent or anything I left behind. I just ran, my flashlight bouncing in the darkness, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't stop until I reached my car, miles away from my campsite. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped away. I never went back for my gear. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this: if I hadn't reacted when I did, if I had hesitated even a second longer, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I don't know why I decided to go on that trip alone. Maybe I was trying to clear my head after everything that had happened. I had been camping for years, always with my wife, always with friends. But this time I had no one. It had been a rough year, and I just wanted to get away from everything. I picked a remote spot in Montana, a place I had been once before with my wife years ago. Back then, it had been a peaceful trip, just the two of us in the middle of the wilderness, away from everything. Now it was just me, and the silence of the woods felt heavier than I remembered. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack, and started hiking in. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I remembered, but I chalked it up to the time of year. The summer had been dry, and the forest felt brittle, brown leaves, cracked branches. The undergrowth flattened like it had been trampled by something large. I ignored it. The plan was to hike about 10 miles in, set up camp near a small lake I remembered, and spend a few days just existing. No phone, no people, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the branches. But things felt off from the start. I kept hearing something in the woods. Not constant, not loud, just something. Every now and then, a branch would snap somewhere off to my right. A rustling in the undergrowth that stopped the second I did. I tried to brush it off. Probably a deer, maybe a bear. I had my rifle with me and I wasn't worried. This was bear country after all. I kept moving. As the sun started dipping behind the mountains, I finally reached the lake. It was just as I remembered. Quiet, still, surrounded by thick pines on all sides. I set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal. It should have been peaceful, but that feeling never left me. That sense of being watched. The woods were too quiet. No barges, no insects, no wind. Just the crackling of my fire and the occasional sound of water lapping against the shore. I forced myself to shake it off. I was being paranoid. It had been a long day, I was alone, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it. A splash. Not a small one, not like a fish jumping. A heavy splash, like something big had stepped into the water. I froze, listening. My firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was just blackness. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the lake, but I didn't see anything. The water was still again. I told myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe, something moving in the shallows. But when I turned back toward my tent, something was different. The gear I had left outside, my water bottle, my cooking pot, my knife, wasn't where I had left it. The knife was gone completely. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. My mind raced for an explanation. Had I moved them without thinking? Had I forgotten where I placed them? I scanned the area with my flashlight. My breath felt too loud in the silence. My fingers itched toward my rifle. Then another sound, this time behind me, a footstep, not an animal, not a bear, a human footstep. I spun around, my light cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stayed up most of the night, sitting by the fire with my rifle across my lap, listening. The woods stayed silent. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, I had almost convinced myself that I was just jumpy, that I had imagined half of it. Maybe I had misplaced my knife. Maybe the sounds were just the forest settling. But I wasn't comfortable staying any longer. I packed up quickly, ready to head back to the truck. I had hiked in on a narrow trail, but as I started walking, something didn't feel right. The path looked different. I stopped, checked my map, looked around. I should have been heading west, back the way I came, but the sun was rising to my right. That meant I was going north. I turned back, retracing my steps. But after a few minutes, I realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. The trees looked different. The ground felt different. The undergrowth was thicker. I had only been walking for 15 minutes. There was no way I had gotten this lost. I tried to stay calm. I had a compass. I had supplies. I could backtrack. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A footprint. Not mine. Someone else's. Deep in the dirt. Fresh. Barefoot. I looked around, scanning the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Just silence. I turned, moved faster, trying to find my way back. Every few minutes, I checked behind me, but I never saw anything. Then the smell hit me. Rot. Decay. Like something had been left out in the sun too long. I gagged, covering my nose. The smell was strong, thick in the air. I followed it not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know what it was. Then I saw it. A deer, or what was left of it. The body was torn open, its insides spread across the ground. But it wasn't just a kill. It had been arranged. Its legs had been bent at strange angles, its head turned too far to the side. And on the ground beside it, my knife. I grabbed my rifle and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. Branches scratched my arms, my legs. The forest blurred around me. My breath came in ragged gasps. I ran until my legs burned, until my vision blurred, until I couldn't run anymore. When I finally stopped, I had no idea where I was. The trees looked the same in every direction. I was lost, and then I heard it. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A human whistle. Long, slow, deliberate. Came from behind me. I didn't turn around. I just started moving again, forcing my legs to keep going. I don't know how long I walked. Hours. The sun was high overhead by the time I finally saw something through the trees. A road. I stumbled out onto the pavement, nearly collapsing. Then I saw my truck. It was parked exactly where I had left it. I hadn't gone 10 miles. I had been walking in circles. I didn't stop to think about it. I didn't stop to breathe. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if something was standing at the tree line. I drove until I hit the nearest town. I booked a motel, locked the door, and didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked my gear. My knife was back in my bag, but the blade was covered in blood. I never went back to that place. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: I wasn't alone. It was late October when I went camping alone in the backwoods of Montana. I had always been comfortable in the wilderness. I grew up hunting with my father, spending days at a time out in the woods. I had learned how to track animals, how to recognize the sounds of the forest, and how to survive on my own. I wasn't afraid of being alone. That year, I had taken a week off work and driven out to a remote spot I had scouted the year before. It was about 15 miles off any real road, surrounded by thick pine and spruce trees. There was a river nearby where I could catch trout, and plenty of game trails where I could set up for hunting. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and far from any distractions. I set up camp just before dark, clearing a small area for my tent and building a fire pit with rocks. The air was crisp, and the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. After cooking a simple meal over the fire, I sat back in my chair and listened to the sounds of the woods. The occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft crackling of my fire. Everything felt right. The first night passed without issue. I slept well, wrapped in my sleeping bag, waking only once when a gust of wind rattled the sides of my tent. The next day, I spent the morning fishing by the river, catching enough to cook for lunch. In the afternoon, I hiked out a few miles, scouting for good spots to hunt later in the week. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I started to get an odd feeling. It was subtle at first, just a strange sense that something wasn't right. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. I had spent enough time outdoors to know the normal sounds of nature, and something was off. No birds, no insects, no distant rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, just silence. I stood up from my chair and looked around. The trees stretched tall and dark, the shadows between them deepening as night settled in. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Maybe a predator had moved into the area, spooking the smaller animals. A bear or a cougar. I had my rifle, my knife, and my wits. There was nothing to be afraid of. Still, I kept my fire burning a little brighter that night. Sometime around midnight, I woke up suddenly. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A long, low sound coming from the trees. It wasn't a howl, not quite. More like a wail, stretched out and distorted. Sent a chill down my spine. I had never heard anything like it before. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. It was followed by a rustling noise, something moving through the brush just beyond my camp. I reached for my rifle, keeping still, listening. The movement stopped. The forest was silent again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, something making strange noises in the night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Not animal tracks, human, barefoot. That was the first time I seriously considered leaving. The tracks were fresh, the imprints deep in the soft earth. They had circled my camp, stopping just a few feet from my tent before leading back into the woods. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I had driven miles off the main road, hiked another few miles in. There were no cabins, no trails, no campsites nearby. No one should have been out here. I packed up most of my gear, deciding to move camp a few miles away. I had no interest in staying where someone had been watching me in the night. By late afternoon, I had set up again in a new spot, deeper into the forest. I made sure to choose a site with good visibility, setting up near a rocky outcrop where I could see in all directions. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were closer. That same awful, wailing cry, coming from just beyond the tree line. Then the rustling again. Slow, deliberate movements, not the quick, darting sounds of an animal. I gripped my rifle and sat by the fire, staring into the darkness. I could feel eyes on me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake, listening, waiting. The feeling of being watched never left. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, not even stopping to eat. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and started the long hike back to my truck. But something followed me. I could hear it moving through the trees, always just out of sight. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I moved, it moved. My pace quickened. My heart pounded. Then, ahead of me, I saw something. First, I thought it was a deer, a figure standing between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. But as I got closer, I realized it was wrong. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. Then it moved, not like a person, not like an animal. It shifted, its form blurring for a moment. Then it was gone. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, my rifle gripped tight in my hands. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I reached my truck and threw my gear inside, slamming the door shut, locking it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I saw it again, standing just at the tree line, watching. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile. Too wide, too many teeth. A grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. I floored the gas pedal and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I don't know what I saw in those woods. I don't want to know. I haven't been back since. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in the wild, away from the noise and the constant movement of the city, that made me feel alive. The air was crisp, the sounds of nature were soothing, and the simplicity of it all cleared my mind. But after what happened that weekend, I don't think I'll ever go camping again. It was late September, right before the air turned freezing, and I had taken a long weekend off work. I drove a few hours out of town to a spot I had been going to for years. It was deep in the woods, past the usual campgrounds where families parked their RVs and set up tents close to their cars. I wanted to be alone, so I went even further in, down an old dirt road, past the signs warning about limited cell service, until I reached a clearing I had found years ago. The clearing was perfect. A wide open space surrounded by tall pines, with a small stream nearby for water. It was completely silent except for the occasional rustling in the trees. I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing and started setting up camp. The sun was beginning to dip below the treetops by the time I had everything ready. I had pitched my tent, set up my small fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last me through the night. The evening air was cool, but I wasn't worried. I had my thick sleeping bag, my hunting knife strapped to my belt, and my rifle locked in the truck just in case. I had camped alone plenty of times before. There was nothing out here but animals, and I knew how to deal with those. I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal on my little stove, letting the quiet sink in. I hadn't seen another person for hours, not since I left the main road. That's what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and the darkening sky. As I ate, I watched the fire flicker, listening to the way the flames cracked against the wood. The only other sounds were the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. It was sharp, loud, close, too close. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, listening. It wasn't the sound of an animal. Animals moved lightly, even the big ones. This was heavier, deliberate. Footsteps. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line behind me. The fire cast long shadows across the clearing, making it harder to see past the trunks. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam toward the sound. Nothing. I waited, barely breathing, my ears strained against the quiet, but after a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime sounds of the woods. Probably just a deer, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon looking for food. I was used to that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I put my plate down and stood up, moving to the truck. I unlocked the door, slid out my rifle, and set it next to my chair by the fire, just in case. The rest of the night passed without anything strange happening. I stayed up for a while, listening, watching, but nothing else moved in the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and crawled into my tent. I slept lightly, waking up at every little noise. The wind through the trees, the shifting of branches. Every sound felt louder, closer. But by morning, the unease had faded, replaced by the normal calm I always felt when waking up in the wilderness. The sun filtered through the trees, warming the cool air. I made coffee on my little stove and sat by the fire, drinking it slowly, letting myself settle. I was being paranoid. It was probably just an animal. I spent most of the day hiking. I followed an old trail that led up to a ridge, where I could see miles of untouched forest stretching out in every direction. No roads, no buildings, no signs of people. It was perfect. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping low again. I started another fire, cooked dinner, and let myself relax. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were in the dirt near my truck, leading toward my tent. My stomach dropped. I stood frozen, staring at them, my mind racing. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, the dirt still loose where it had been pressed down. Someone had been here. I looked around, my heart pounding. The trees were thick, shadows stretching between them, but I couldn't see anyone. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I grabbed my rifle, keeping it close as I crouched down to examine the prints. They were big, a man's boot larger than mine, and there were more than just one set, 2, maybe 3 different sets of prints. I followed them carefully, moving around my camp. They circled the tent, led toward the edge of the clearing, then disappeared into the trees. Someone had been watching me while I was gone. A cold dread settled into my stomach. I had been out here alone for hours, thinking I was safe, but I wasn't. I backed toward the fire, my eyes scanning the treeline. If they had been here earlier, where were they now? I stayed up that night, rifle in my lap, watching the woods. I didn't go inside the tent. I kept the fire burning high, the flames casting flickering light into the trees. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it. I wasn't alone. At some point, exhaustion started to pull at me, my eyes drooping despite the fear. I forced myself to stay awake, gripping my rifle tighter. Then, just past the reach of the firelight, I saw it, a figure, standing between the trees. It didn't move, just stood there, barely visible in the dark. Watching me, my blood turned ice cold. I raised the rifle, aiming at the figure. My hands were steady, my finger on the trigger. I blinked. It was gone. I jumped to my feet, my heart hammering. I scanned the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, gripping my rifle, waiting for morning. The moment the first light touched the trees, I packed up. I moved quickly, shoving my gear into the truck, keeping my back to nothing. I didn't care about breakfast, about the last bit of coffee still in my thermos. I just wanted to leave. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I took one last look around, and that's when I saw it. Carved into the tree, just behind where my tent had been, were words, deep, jagged slashes in the bark. "You shouldn't be here." I slammed the door shut and started the truck, my hands shaking. Gravel spit out behind me as I tore out of the clearing, heading back down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, back where I could see other cars, other people. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted, but I never went back.